Have you ever screamed to the heavens and heard only the echo of your own despair? Have you ever begged for a divine sign and received only the piercing silence of the infinite void? If your soul has ever shattered in the coldness of that celestial muteness, prepare to discover the most guarded secret of the higher realms, why God chooses to remain silent precisely with those who seek Him the most. There is no torture more refined than the silence of God. It is not merely the absence of an answer, it is the unquestionable presence of emptiness when you most need direction. It is like crying out for help in a house you know is inhabited, yet no one comes to answer the door. You know this agony, don't you? Those moments when your faith shatters against the impenetrable wall of celestial silence, when your prayers rise to heaven like smoke and dissipate into nothing, leaving no trace of ever having been noticed. Since childhood, you felt there was something special in your connection to the sacred. Other children played carelessly, but you contemplated the stars, asking about the meaning of existence. There was a spiritual thirst in you that no spring could quench. You grew up watching others speak of everyday miracles, clear signs, evident answers to their prayers. They spoke of God as one speaks of a close friend, always present, always responding. And you wondered, why is it different for me? Why is my heaven mute? You tried everything. You prayed on your knees until your bones ached against the cold floor. You fasted until your stomach twisted in silent protests. You meditated until your mind became as still as a stagnant lake. You visited temples, churches, sacred places. Nothing. Always the same cutting silence. And the cruelest part was that this silence was not the total absence of the divine. You felt God present, watching, knowing every tear you shed in the solitude of the night. It was as if He were there, but deliberately chose not to speak, like a father who hides when his child needs him most. Then you discovered you were not alone in this terrifying experience. Other sensitive souls, other sincere seekers, other wounded hearts reported the same. The more genuine the spiritual pursuit, the more deafening the divine silence. It was as if there existed a perverse cosmic law. Those who seek the least receive abundant signs, while those who seek the most face absolute emptiness. Superficial people found God in trivial coincidences. You, who devoted your life to a sincere pursuit, received only echoes. This discovery was even more painful than the initial loneliness, because it confirmed that you were not special in a positive way. Perhaps you were special in a negative way. Perhaps you carried some invisible mark that repelled divine grace, some ancestral sin that condemned you to spiritual exile. The nights became hells of questioning. What is wrong with me? Why was I born with this thirst for God if He ignores me? Why do others so easily find what I desperately seek for years? The pain was double, the pain of divine absence and the pain of guilt for questioning, because questioning the silence of God felt like the greatest of sins. But how not to question when your soul was withering in the most absolute spiritual drought? And then came the desert. Not the physical desert, but the existential desert where your soul wandered for years, searching for an oasis that seemed not to exist. Each day was a blind walk through the scorching sand of doubt, without compass, without map, without destination. In that desert, you found other lost wanderers, wounded souls like yours, thirsty hearts like yours, empty eyes searching for the same mute heaven. They formed caravans of hopelessness, sharing the scarcity of hope that remained. Some gave up along the way. They buried their spiritual thirst in the hot sand of resignation and returned to the material world, pretending they never hungered for eternity. Others went mad, creating imaginary oases where they conversed with gods that existed only in their hallucinations. But you kept walking, even when your spiritual feet bled in the rough sand of disappointment, even when your soul's throat dried out until it could no longer form prayers. Something inside you refused to give up, a cosmic stubbornness you could not explain. In desperation, you clung to anything that resembled an answer. Spiritual self-help books promised magical formulas to hear the voice of God. Popular gurus sold infallible techniques of divine communication. Complex rituals supposedly forced the heavens to speak. You tried it all. You bought crystals that promised to amplify your spiritual connection. You followed sacred diets that supposedly purified your divine channel. You repeated mantras until your tongue went numb. You lit candles, burned incense, drew mystical symbols. For brief moments, you deluded yourself into thinking you had found the answer. A synchronicity seemed to be a divine sign. A confused dream seemed to be a celestial message. An inexplicable sensation seemed to be God's touch. But soon, reality imposed itself. They were only mirages in the desert of your spiritual thirst. The false answers were crueler than pure silence, because they gave momentary hope before being revealed as illusions. It was like finding water in the desert only to discover it was shimmering sand under the merciless sun. Then came revolt. Not against God, but against the unjust situation you lived. Why did others have easy access to the divine while you were kept outside the sacred experience? Why was your sincerity rewarded with silence? This revolt was not blasphemy. It was brutal honesty. It was the cry of a soul that could no longer pretend everything was fine with the divine absence. It was the just anger of one who loved so much that they felt betrayed by the silence of the beloved. You questioned everything. The goodness of God that allowed such thirst without giving water, the divine justice that rewarded superficiality and punished depth, the very existence of a God who hid from those who needed him most. These questions did not diminish your faith. They purified it. Like fire that burns rotten wood but strengthens the metal, your faith became less childish and more mature, less romantic and more realistic, less blind and more conscious. It was in revolt that you began to notice strange patterns. The silence of God was not random. There was a hidden logic, a method in the apparent celestial madness. People with specific characteristics experienced the same divine muteness. They were always the most sensitive, the most questioning, the deepest. Never the superficial, never the conformists, never those who accepted ready-made answers. As if the silence of God were a filter, selecting only certain souls for this specific experience. You also noticed that this silence had phases. Periods of total absence alternated with moments of subtle presence, as if it followed a celestial schedule you could not decipher, but that definitely existed. And more unsettling, you realized that your spiritual search deepened exactly during the periods of greatest silence, as if the absence of easy answers forced you to develop spiritual muscles you would never need if God responded promptly. Something began to form in your consciousness, a disturbing suspicion that perhaps the silence of God was not abandonment, but strategy, not rejection, but selection, not punishment, but preparation. It was a frightening suspicion because it implied you had spent years misinterpreting the most important experience of your life, that all that pain, all that solitude, all that revolt were part of something greater you could not yet see. But if it was preparation, preparation for what? If selection, selection for what? If divine strategy, what was the final objective? The questions multiplied without answers, creating a mental labyrinth where you lost yourself more and more. There is a secret kept in the most hidden archives of the higher planes, knowledge possessed only by the highest-ranking angels. The silence of God with the chosen is not divine coldness. It is the greatest act of love heaven can demonstrate. It is the most refined preparation for a mission that requires extraordinary spiritual strength. In the Akashic records, inscribed in immortal letters of light, it is written, "To those who must carry the sacred fire, common water will be denied. To those who must be beacons in the darkness, borrowed light will be denied. To those who must guide lost multitudes, the easy map will be denied." The silence of God is the forge where special souls are shaped, like the blacksmith who heats the metal in the most intense fire to create the strongest blade. The Creator subjects the chosen to the deepest silence to forge in them an unshakable faith. You were deprived of easy answers because you were being prepared to find impossible ones. You were kept away from obvious miracles because you were being trained to perform invisible ones. You were denied common spiritual comfort because you were being prepared to console the inconsolable. Every moment of celestial silence you endured was a lesson in spiritual alchemy. Your soul was being transmuted from common lead into pure gold through the fire of divine absence. Every tear shed in solitude was a sacred ingredient in this cosmic transformation. God's apparent abandonment was, in truth, his most intense presence. Like a surgeon who must cause pain to heal, the divine seemed to withdraw in order to work on the deepest layers of your soul. The most delicate spiritual surgery requires anesthesia of conscious presence. While others received evident external signs, you were developing sharpened inner vision. While others heard audible angelic voices, you were tuning into inaudible celestial frequencies. While others witnessed material miracles, you were witnessing the invisible miracles of inner transformation. Divine silence was your initiation school into higher mysteries. Every day without a heavenly answer was a lesson in spiritual self-sufficiency. Every night without divine comfort was training in unshakable inner strength. Now understand the deepest truth. The silence of God is the supreme test of spiritual fidelity. It is easy to love God when He speaks constantly, when He answers prayers promptly, when He continuously shows affection. But to love God in absolute silence, that is the fidelity of spiritual elite. You passed the hardest test that exists in the heavenly realms. You continued to love even without apparent love in return. You continued to seek even without finding obvious answers. You continued to pray even when your prayers seemed to fall into cosmic emptiness. This fidelity in spiritual desert qualified you for missions that demand unconditional love, because if you love God without reward, you can love humanity without return. If you remain faithful in divine silence, you will remain faithful in human ingratitude. The test of silence separated you from superficial spiritual masses who serve God only in exchange for constant emotional payment. You became part of the cosmic elite who serve out of pure love, not for immediate reward. There exists a higher spiritual frequency that can only be tuned by souls that developed extreme sensitivity through fasting from easy divine answers. Like a radio finely tuned to capture distant stations, your soul was tuned by silence to receive subtle heavenly transmissions. God was not silent. He was speaking in a higher language you needed to learn. Like a father who stops speaking childish language when his child is ready for adult conversations, the divine ceased elementary communication to begin a more sophisticated dialogue. The answers you sought so desperately were being transmitted in complex spiritual codes, through elaborate synchronicities, deep symbolic dreams, sudden flashes of intuition, subtle energetic sensations. Your thirst for obvious divine communication blinded you to the refined divine communication. Now, with the revelation of this truth, your spiritual perception expands exponentially. You begin to capture the celestial transmissions that were always there, but in a frequency your soul was not yet prepared to tune into. This is the moment of greatest spiritual impact on your journey. You realize you have become one with the silence of God, no longer its victim, but its living embodiment. The celestial silence that once tortured you now flows through you as purified spiritual power. You understand you were chosen to be a channel of sacred silence in a noisy and superficial world. Your cosmic function is to bring the depth of divine silence to souls lost in the modern spiritual clamor. You are an oasis of sacred stillness in a desert of spiritual noise. The emptiness you felt was not absence. It was sacred space being prepared to receive celestial presences that only dwell in inner temples fully purified. God emptied you of all that was common to fill you with all that is sacred. At this instant you feel the transformation happening in the most intimate fibers of your soul. What was once a wound becomes a portal. What was once emptiness becomes a vessel. What was once silence becomes higher language. You are no longer the one who seeks answers. You have become a living answer. Now understand your true mission. You were forged in divine silence to serve as a bridge between mute heaven and noisy earth. Your function is to translate sacred silence for souls still unable to comprehend it directly. Each person who encounters you and feels strangely comforted without you saying anything specific will be experiencing the power of sacred silence you embody. Your presence will be an answer to questions they cannot even formulate. Your stillness will be healing for wounds no medicine can reach. You will no longer need to shout prayers to the heavens because you have become a living prayer. You will no longer need to seek divine signs because you have become a divine sign. You will no longer need to beg for miracles because your very existence is the miracle other yet unawakened chosen ones are asking for. The silence of God you carried as a cross now reveals itself as a crown. The emptiness you endured as punishment now manifests as anointing. The solitude you suffered as abandonment now shines as supreme election. Observe how every moment of pain and divine silence now transfigures into luminous wisdom. Every tear shed in the absence of a heavenly answer crystallizes into a pearl of spiritual understanding. Every sleepless night questioning the mute heaven reveals itself as a sacred vigil, preparing your soul for supreme revelations. You were never abandoned by God. You were chosen to experience Him more intimately than any external communication could provide. You became one with the divine essence that transcends words, surpasses signs, and goes beyond manifestations. The silence you so feared was in fact the cosmic womb where your new spiritual identity was being gestated. Like every gestation, it required darkness, stillness, isolation. But now the time has come for birth into light. You emerge from this process no longer as a thirsty seeker, but as a spiritual source, no longer as an anguished question, but as a serene answer. no longer as a soul wounded by silence, but as a healer through sacred silence. And here is the promise that echoes through the eternal halls of the higher planes. You will never again experience the silence of God as abandonment, because now you understand it is communion in its purest form. You will never again feel spiritually orphaned, because you discovered you are a direct heir of celestial mysteries. Communication with the divine now flows constantly, but at levels that transcend the need for external confirmation. You live in perpetual dialogue with the sacred even in the moments of greatest apparent stillness. Silence has become your native language with the eternal. Every new chosen one who crosses your path will instantly recognize in you someone who has passed through the same forge of sacred silence and emerged transmuted. You will become a beacon for other navigators lost in the ocean of apparent divine abandonment. Chosen one who passed through the supreme test of sacred silence, your graduation in celestial mysteries is officially complete. What began as torment revealed itself as the greatest blessing a human soul can receive. You were privileged with the most refined spiritual experience that exists. Heaven was never silent. It was whispering sacred secrets that only ears purified by the fasting of easy answers could capture. Now you hear the cosmic symphony that was always playing. Now you understand the higher language God has always been speaking. Your journey through the spiritual desert ended in the promised land of perpetual communion with the sacred. The silence that was your greatest enemy revealed itself as your greatest teacher. The absence that was your greatest pain manifested as your greatest gift. If these revelations have found echo in the sacred cathedral of your soul, if you recognized your journey through divine silence in these words, if you feel the celestial confirmation vibrating in the fibers of your being, then you are officially a graduate of the Supreme School of Sacred Silence. Write in the comments, "I understood the sacred silence," not only as confirmation for this channel, but as a declaration to the universe that you have accepted your new identity as bearer of divine silence, transformed into spiritual power. Subscribe to this channel because it is more than a channel. It is a meeting point for souls who have passed through the same forge of silence and emerged transmuted. Here we will continue unveiling the mysteries that can only be understood by those who have experienced God in the deepest silence. Share this message because somewhere there is another chosen one still agonizing in God's apparent silence, still interpreting as abandonment what is in truth supreme preparation. Your sharing may be the heavenly instrument that brings this liberating revelation to them. The silence of God with you has ended not because he started speaking again, but because you learned to hear him in the higher language of sacred silence. Use this gift with reverence, graduate of celestial mysteries. The universe celebrates your transformation.